Looking back, those weekend nights felt like a different lifetime. Growing up, my friends and I, Steve, Tom, Jake, and me, spent every Saturday playing in the street until the stars came out. Our neighborhood was small, quiet, and safe, a place where parents felt at ease letting their kids run around until late. It was our time, those weekend nights, a little pocket of freedom we all looked forward to, filled with laughter and the innocent thrill of adventure. The street was like our own little kingdom. We'd spend hours playing all sorts of games, our voices echoing through the neighborhood as we chased each other or made up stories about the houses we passed. There was a comfort in the routine, a sense that nothing could go wrong. We'd get tired, go home, and do it all over again the next weekend. It was simple. We were just a bunch of kids, and the world, though dark around us, never felt like a threat. But that night felt different, though I couldn't have explained why. The air was unusually still, the street empty as usual, yet something about it felt off. It was almost as if the shadows had grown longer, stretching toward us in the dim evening light. Still, we were just kids, and that night was like any other, until it wasn't. It was getting late, and we'd already started talking about heading home. The street lights were on, casting their usual yellow glow, and we knew it was probably time to call it a night. But just as we were about to head off, something strange happened. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. We stood there in the sudden darkness, each of us silent, the laughter from minutes earlier replaced by an eerie quiet. I felt a strange unease, a creeping discomfort that I tried to push down. We were still just kids, but standing there in the pitch black, we weren't laughing anymore. Someone, probably Tom, tried to make a joke, but his voice sounded thin, almost as if he were trying to convince himself there was nothing to be afraid of. For a moment, we stood in silence, hoping the lights would flicker back on, but they didn't. The night had swallowed us, and with every second, it felt like the darkness grew thicker, pressing in from all sides. There was a tension among us, an unspoken agreement that we'd stick together. None of us wanted to admit we were scared, but I could feel it, hear it in the shallow breaths and uneasy shuffling of feet. And though none of us said it, we knew we couldn't stay there. So we turned, bunching close, and began to walk back toward our homes, every step filled with a quiet dread. As we walked, the silence only made things worse. Each of us was trying to act tough, trying to keep up the illusion that we weren't scared. But the darkness had a way of twisting things. Every shadow looked longer, every noise sharper, as if the night itself was watching us. We moved in a tight group, practically shoulder to shoulder, each of us hyper-aware of every sound around us. The usual creaks and whispers of the night seemed louder, somehow unnatural. I could feel my heart beating faster, a cold tension gripping me. None of us spoke, and that silence, filled with unspoken fear, somehow made it all worse. I kept my eyes forward, trying to focus on the road, but I could feel my senses heighten, each sound prickling along my skin. It was just a short walk to my house, but the distance felt longer, stretched by the tension in the air. I could feel the presence of my friends around me, and that gave me a bit of comfort, but it was small, like holding on to a thread in a storm. And then, just as we were nearing the corner, Steve's voice broke the silence. "There's someone," he whispered, his voice trembling. I turned, following his gaze, and that's when I saw him, a figure in the darkness, moving slowly, coming toward us. My stomach dropped, fear rooting me to the spot. I didn't know who he was, but something in me screamed that we had to get away. The figure moved closer, his steps slow and deliberate, almost as if he were savoring the approach. I could barely make out his face in the darkness, but his silhouette was enough to send a wave of fear through me. We all stood frozen, not daring to move, our breaths barely audible. It was like some twisted game, the man inching closer and us too terrified to break the silence. I felt a sharp pang of panic, an instinct telling me that we needed to run. Tom was the first to break free from the frozen silence, muttering that we should get out of there. I glanced at the others, and we all seemed to come to the same realization. Without another word, we turned and sprinted, the sound of our footsteps echoing down the empty street. But as I ran, I noticed Steve wasn't with us. I glanced back and my heart dropped. He was still standing there, rooted to the spot as the man closed in. I wanted to go back, to grab him, but fear took over, pushing me forward. I could feel the guilt tugging at me, but my legs wouldn't stop. It was pure survival instinct, the terror too great to ignore. As I reached my house, I looked back once more, catching a glimpse of Steve in the figure. The image seared itself into my mind, Steve's small frame overshadowed by the stranger's dark outline. I stumbled through the front door, breathless, barely able to get the words out as I told my father what had happened, begging him to call the police. My father's face went pale as he listened to my rushed words, his eyes darting to the front door, as if expecting the man to appear at any moment. He didn't hesitate, quickly got in touch with a friend of his in the police force, who was still on active duty, via a very old satellite phone he had. His voice calm, but with a tension I'd never heard before. I stood there, trembling, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle in. My friends, Tom and Jake, sat beside me, their faces as pale as mine, the fear still fresh in our eyes. Minutes passed, feeling like hours, as we waited for the police to arrive. I tried to push the thought away, telling myself the police would find him, that he'd be all right. But the guilt gnawed at me, the feeling that I'd left my friend behind, that I hadn't done enough to protect him. When the police finally arrived, they didn't waste time. They questioned me, their voices calm yet intense, asking for every detail I could remember. I told them about the man, his slow, purposeful approach, how Steve had frozen in place. The officers shared a look, their expressions grim, and I realized they understood the gravity of what had happened. Without another word, they headed into the night, searching for any sign of Steve or the stranger. The hours that followed felt like a blur, a mix of fear and guilt that left me numb. I sat in the living room with my father, the silence between us heavy. He didn't say much, only placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder, but I could feel his worry. I wanted to believe that Steve was all right, that he'd show up any minute, laughing about the scare we'd all gotten. But deep down, I knew things weren't that simple. The police returned after what felt like an eternity, their faces somber. They'd searched the area but found nothing. No sign of Steve, no trace of the stranger. One of the officers pulled my father aside, speaking in hushed tones, but I could catch fragments of their conversation. Words like abandoned houses and check again. My father's face grew more tense with every word, and I felt a sickening sense of dread settle over me. It was then that one of the officers mentioned an old house not far from where we'd been playing. It had been empty for years, left to decay, its windows boarded up, its doors locked. But I knew the house. We'd passed it 100 times, always telling each other it was haunted, that strange things happened inside. The police seemed to think it was worth a look, and I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope, a sliver of a chance that they might find Steve there. The police left to investigate the house. My father, my friends, and I waited. After about 40 minutes, they arrived again, but this time with Steve in their arms. He was found almost unconscious in the house. I cried with happiness and fear at the same time because I didn't know what to do. It was a mixture of emotions. In the end, he went to hospital, and everything ended well. I never thought staying home alone could feel so strange. It was meant to be a quiet evening. My family had left for an event, and though they'd insisted I come along, I'd chosen to stay behind. I wasn't feeling well, just a slight fever and fatigue, and it felt easier to curl up on the sofa with a blanket than to force myself through a crowded night out. The house was usually comforting, a familiar space filled with the sounds and scents of our everyday life. As the evening set in, I found myself relaxing, letting the gentle lull of the television fill the empty spaces. It was almost peaceful, the quietness of the house amplifying every small sound, yet somehow making me feel secure. The distant hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the house settling, these were sounds I knew well, sounds that had always been there. I barely noticed the time passing, and a part of me found a strange contentment in being alone. My own little world cocooned within the walls of my home. I had no reason to feel uneasy. After all, I'd stayed home alone countless times before, but there was something in the air that night, a sense that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't enough to make me worried, but it lingered there, just at the edge of my awareness. I brushed it off, turning my attention back to the show, convincing myself it was nothing. I must have drifted off at some point, lulled by the faint hum of the TV and the warmth of my blanket. But something pulled me back, a faint, barely audible noise. I sat up, listening, straining to catch any sound over the low volume of the TV. It was a quiet shuffle, or maybe a creak, something that felt just out of place. I dismissed it at first, telling myself it was probably just the wind or perhaps an animal outside. Still, my mind was now alert, my senses tuned to every sound around me. I glanced around the room, feeling a slight twinge of unease. The silence returned, the sound seemingly gone, and I allowed myself to relax, settling back into the sofa, but my sense of calm was slightly shaken. Minutes passed, and I started to convince myself that it had just been my imagination, a trick of the quiet. But then the sound came again, louder this time. A soft creak, as if someone were slowly shifting weight, testing the strength of a floorboard. The calm of the evening shattered. I tried to stay calm, rationalizing that it had to be something explainable. But deep down, a part of me knew something wasn't right. I sat there, my eyes fixed on the front door, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, a figure standing just beyond the door, its outline barely visible in the dim light. I froze, my heart racing as I watched the figure reach for the door handle, slowly, as if testing it. Panic surged through me, and I clamped a hand over my mouth, desperate to stay silent, to make myself invisible. For a few seconds I sat motionless, too terrified to think, hoping against hope that the person would leave. But the figure remained there, fiddling with the handle, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. This wasn't a friend or a neighbor. This was someone trying to get in. The reality of it hit me hard, and my mind raced as I thought about what to do. In a rush of panic, I decided I couldn't stay by the door. I had to move to get to my room where I could call for help. Trying to stay as silent as possible, I slid off the sofa, my legs feeling weak beneath me as I made my way toward the hallway. I kept my eyes on the figure, barely daring to breathe, praying he wouldn't notice me. I'd only made it halfway to my room when the lights suddenly went out, plunging the entire house into darkness. I froze, my heart hammering as I stood there, disoriented, my sense of direction completely thrown off. The sudden shift to darkness felt suffocating, an oppressive silence filling the space around me. I felt vulnerable, exposed, and utterly lost. For a moment I stood there, paralyzed, every nerve in my body on edge. I could still hear faint sounds from outside, footsteps perhaps, or maybe just my own racing heartbeat echoing in my ears. The darkness seemed to amplify everything, turning the familiar layout of my house into a disorienting maze. My thoughts spun wildly as I considered my options. Running blindly to my room felt too risky, and the windows seemed too close to where the figure was. Desperately trying to stay calm, I felt my way along the wall, moving toward the kitchen. There was a small gap behind the fridge, a tight space, but one that might hide me well enough if I stayed still. My fingers brushed against the cool metal of the refrigerator, and I slipped into the narrow space, wedging myself in as best as I could. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to quiet my breathing as I listened, waiting, hoping that whoever was outside would go away. The small gap behind the fridge was cramped, the cold metal pressing against my back as I squeezed myself into the narrow space. I held my breath, barely daring to make a sound. My heart raced so hard I could feel it in my throat, each beat pounding in sync with the footsteps approaching my door. Every second stretched painfully, the silence around me feeling as thick as the darkness. Then the front door burst open with a loud crash. I jumped slightly, instinctively pressing myself further into the corner. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house, and I could hear low voices murmuring, their words too quiet to make out. But one thing was clear. There were two of them. I could hear their voices distinctly, moving around as if searching each room, their flashlights casting fleeting, distorted shadows on the walls. One of them moved toward the kitchen, his footsteps growing louder with each step. I felt a cold sweat prickling at my skin, my breathing shallow as I listened to him getting closer. The beam of his flashlight swept across the kitchen, illuminating the room in brief bursts. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping he wouldn't check behind the fridge, that my hiding spot was obscure enough to keep me hidden. The light hovered near the fridge for a moment, casting a faint glow around me. I stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe, praying that he wouldn't come any closer. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the light moved away, the man's footsteps fading slightly as he turned his attention elsewhere. I waited, listening as the intruders split up, one moving upstairs while the other remained on the ground floor. Every sound, every creak felt like a threat, making my pulse quicken. The footsteps upstairs echoed down the stairwell, while the other man's steps seemed to hover around the main rooms, methodically searching each one. I could hear them rifling through drawers, shuffling around furniture, the sounds of things being knocked over. I realized with a sickening dread that they were looking for something, or maybe just ransacking the house out of spite. The man in the kitchen moved further away, giving me a brief window of time. My mind raced, weighing my options. I knew I couldn't stay here indefinitely. If they came back to search more thoroughly, they'd find me. I glanced toward the doorway, gauging the distance, feeling the urgent need to get out, to escape. But every fiber of my being was gripped by fear, the thought of moving terrifying. I waited, heart pounding, until the man climbed the stairs, joining his partner. Taking a deep breath, I pushed myself out of the gap behind the fridge, careful not to make a sound. The darkness felt like a heavy weight, and my senses were on high alert as I carefully, silently made my way toward the front door. The distance between me and the front door felt impossibly long, every step feeling like a gamble. I inched my way across the darkened living room, flinching at the faintest sound. My fingers brushed against the door handle, the cold metal sending a jolt through me. I held my breath, twisting it as quietly as I could, hoping the sound wouldn't alert the men upstairs. With one last glance over my shoulder, I pulled the door open and slipped outside, the cool night air hitting my face like a shock. I forced myself to stay calm, fighting the urge to sprint across the yard, knowing I had to stay quiet. The shadows felt both comforting and menacing as I crossed to my neighbor's house, my heart pounding with every step. I reached his front door and knocked softly, hoping he was home. My heart raced with each passing second, my mind filled with images of the men coming after me. I knocked again, harder this time, and within moments, the door opened, revealing my neighbor's concerned face. Without waiting for him to speak, I pushed past him into the house, my words tumbling out as I tried to explain what had happened. Once inside, I collapsed onto a chair, my body shaking with a mix of fear and relief. My neighbor listened intently, his expression growing darker with every word. Without hesitation, he picked up his phone and called the police, describing the break-in and assuring them that I was safe at his house. The tension in the room was thick, both of us glancing toward my house as though expecting the intruders to appear at any moment. When the police arrived, they swept through my house, searching each room, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I watched from my neighbor's window, feeling both detached and painfully aware of every movement. Minutes passed before the officers emerged, their faces blank but not surprised. They'd found no sign of the men, only evidence of their presence, scattered items, open drawers, a few belongings missing. My family arrived shortly after, their faces a mix of worry and shock. I explained what had happened. As the police had already searched and found nothing, they left and said they were going to look around. We went home and locked up, and when I went to bed that night, the thoughts wouldn't stop. But my mother helped me, and I'm glad it all ended well in the end. Life had a rhythm, a predictable, ordinary rhythm. My days felt like they blurred together, each one marked by the hum of electricity and the soft glow of lights at night. But that routine shattered when the blackout hit. It wasn't the first time the power had gone out, but this one felt different. Hours turned into days, and soon it became clear that this wasn't just a brief outage. People began speculating about the cause, but with no way to charge phones or contact the outside world, the theories remained just that, speculations. Darkness settled in like an unwelcome guest, and we found ourselves forced to adapt. As the days went on, some of the older residents in our neighborhood brought out battery-operated radios, one of the few lifelines we had left to the world beyond. My family didn't have one, but our neighbors, the Thompsons, did, and each night we gathered around the crackling device, hoping for some news, some clue as to when life might return to normal. The sound of static became a familiar background noise, broken only by faint voices that drifted in and out, sounding strangely detached from the world we knew. The radios offered little comfort, though. Instead of reassuring updates, all we heard were ominous warnings from unknown voices, barely audible but filled with tension. They spoke in frantic tones about dangers beyond our comprehension, external threats lurking in the darkness. But no one seemed to know where the broadcasts were coming from, or what exactly they were warning us about. The voices were unsettling, filling us with a quiet dread that settled over our small neighborhood like a shadow. Each night, we returned to the Thompsons' house, drawn to the eerie broadcasts that had become a bizarre new ritual. The voices on the radio were always tense, urgent, warning of dangers without giving specifics. It felt like we were listening to someone else's nightmare, the broken fragments of a story we couldn't fully understand. The strange transmissions filled the silence of the blackout, casting an uneasy spell over our community. The warnings were cryptic, almost nonsensical at times. One night, a voice spoke about keeping watch and staying out of sight. We tried to make sense of the fragmented messages, but each interpretation only fueled our fear. A part of me wondered if it was some elaborate hoax, or maybe just the ramblings of someone disconnected from reality. But another part of me, the part that couldn't shake the feeling of dread, believed every word. As the nights dragged on, those around me grew increasingly tense. I could see it in their faces, the subtle looks of fear they tried to hide, the way they glanced nervously toward the windows. The transmissions had become a haunting backdrop to our lives, a constant reminder that something was wrong, that we were no longer safe in the way we once believed. The days blended into each other, each one marked by the heavy silence of a powerless world. At night, the tension was almost unbearable. The transmissions continued, but they became less coherent, filled with static and strange noises that made the voices sound distorted, almost inhuman. Every time we listened, it felt as though the world outside had grown darker, more hostile. The sounds in the night added to the fear. On the third night, I began hearing strange noises outside, distant footsteps, the occasional murmur, the sound of metal clinking as though someone were handling tools. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more frightening than the last. It was on the fourth night that things took a disturbing turn. We'd gathered around the radio as usual, hoping for some update, some answer to what was happening. But that night, the broadcast was different. There were no voices, no strange warnings. Instead, we heard the unmistakable sound of a door breaking, splintering wood echoing through the speakers, followed by frantic footsteps and muffled screams. It was a sound that made my blood run cold, a noise so visceral that it felt as though it were happening right there in the room with us. Everyone around me froze, our eyes wide as we listened, the silence of the room punctuated only by the terrified breathing of those around me. The sounds continued, a chaotic mix of panicked voices, hurried footsteps, and the low murmur of someone muttering in the background, as though giving orders. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a recording, and it wasn't a broadcast from somewhere far away. This was happening here, nearby. Panic spread through the room, whispers of fear mingling with the tension in the air. We didn't know what to do, didn't know if what we were hearing was some kind of terrible coincidence or an imminent threat. But deep down, I knew we couldn't ignore it. The sounds were real, and whatever was happening was getting closer. As the sounds grew louder, panic settled in among us. Someone whispered that they'd seen figures moving between the houses, and a sense of dread took hold. It wasn't just random noises on a radio. There was a real threat outside, creeping closer. I felt a chill run through me as I realized that the frantic transmissions had been warnings, real and urgent. Whatever was out there had made its way to our neighborhood. In the dim candlelight, I saw fear reflected on every face around me. My heart pounded as we huddled together, trying to decide what to do. Outside, the sounds of breaking doors and heavy footsteps grew louder, punctuated by muffled screams and frantic cries. A gang was moving from house to house, breaking in, searching for anything they could take. This wasn't some distant threat. It was right outside our doors, coming closer with every passing minute. Without saying a word, we started moving, grabbing anything we could use to barricade the doors and windows. It felt like a nightmare, a situation we'd only ever heard about in stories. But this was real, and the only choice left was to find a safe place to hide. In a hushed whisper, someone suggested the attic, a place far from the immediate reach of the intruders. We moved as quietly as we could, creeping up the narrow stairs, hoping that the darkness would shield us. The attic was cramped and dusty, but it offered a sense of security, a small barrier between us and the chaos unfolding below. My family and a few neighbors crowded in, our breaths shallow as we huddled together in the oppressive dark. From our hiding spot, we could hear the gang downstairs, their voices low and tense as they tore through the rooms, knocking over furniture, opening cabinets. The sounds were terrifyingly close, a reminder that we were just one thin wall away from discovery. I clamped my hand over my mouth, trying to quiet my own breathing, feeling the weight of fear pressing down on me. Each sound, each crash of broken glass felt like a warning that we might be next. The intruders moved through the house methodically, taking anything of value. Their voices, harsh and commanding, sent a shiver down my spine. I could feel my pulse pounding as they grew closer to the stairs, their footsteps heavy as they reached the bottom step. My mind raced, bracing for the worst, for the moment they'd climb the stairs and find us hiding, trapped in the darkness. Just as I felt certain they'd come up to the attic, a noise outside distracted them, a loud crash, maybe from another neighbor trying to draw them away. Their footsteps paused, and for one agonizing moment, silence filled the air. I held my breath, clinging to the hope that they'd leave, that we'd somehow escape. Slowly, their footsteps retreated, moving back down the stairs, their voices fading as they left the house. I could feel the tension ease slightly, though no one dared move or speak. We remained frozen, listening to the sounds of the gang moving down the street, the muffled shouts and breaking doors marking their path through the neighborhood. The weight of fear remained, but there was a flicker of hope now, a sense that we'd narrowly avoided a terrible fate. I could feel my body relax slightly, though my mind remained on high alert, every sound still feeling like a threat. Hours later, when the silence returned, we cautiously made our way down from the attic, our steps careful as though the floor itself might betray us. The house was unrecognizable, drawers pulled open, furniture overturned, a few things missing but most left in disarray. The sight of it all, the remnants of chaos, sent a chill through me, a reminder of how close we'd come to danger, and how quickly things can go sideways.